In part one of our overview of Harry Frankfurt's article, The Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility, we looked at his reasoning behind rejecting the principle of alternate possibilities, or more appropriately, the principle of alternative possibilities. And that principle was a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. So in part two, we consider a couple revisions here of that principle and see what Frankfurt thinks. So he's argued already that the initial principle is false. So what might be a principle in the neighborhood, something that is legitimate and doesn't fall to these kinds of counterexamples that he's imagined? Well, one suggestion is to revise PAP in this way. So this would be the second version. A person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it because he could not have done otherwise. Now, this principle also fails, and seemingly, I don't think it's really spelled out very clearly, but I believe it's because Frankfurt thinks in this way. Consider the hiring manager who is looking at the applicant who is clearly the most qualified and ought to be hired, but also who has been offered this irresistible bribe. Now, Aristotle's views on moral responsibility notwithstanding, Frankfurt says the irresistible bribe then is causing the person to hire the individual, right? There are two causes there. So he should be held morally responsible, even though he was caused to do it, right? So this seems to be a counterexample to this claim that a person is not morally responsible for what he's done if he did it because he could not have done otherwise. We should still hold this person morally responsible. So the idea is that a person may have wanted to do X and did X because of that desire, but also because he could not have done otherwise. There were no alternatives in that situation. What else could we say? What other principle might be valid that doesn't follow these counterexamples? Well, Frankfurt proposes this one. A person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it only because he could not have done otherwise. So the idea here, this rules out our situations that involve overdetermination. They're not a concern, they're not a problem anymore. And Frankfurt argues that this last revision allows more responsibility here. It captures our normal intuition. It also allows determinism to be compatible with moral responsibility. And so we have this situation now where, contrary to our initial intuition, determinism, maybe it does rule out free will, but it doesn't rule out moral responsibility. And so we have this argument now that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. And so Frankfurt says this last principle seems to be true. It's what lies behind our intuition that the original PAP had, that why we thought it was true. But this principle shows that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, right? So let's spell this out. What if determinism is true? Well, what are the consequences? If the original principle of alternative possibilities is false, that means moral responsibility is consistent with determinism. And that means you don't have to debate this issue of whether determinism is relevant to freedom or not, because the most important aspect of freedom is moral responsibility. And now we've solved it from Frankfurt's perspective. Moral responsibility is consistent with determinism. It doesn't matter how the world turns out to be. If future physics realizes or decides that we actually are determined in everything that we do, then it doesn't matter. We can still be held morally responsible. It just doesn't matter whether determinism is true or not. We could be morally responsible if it is true, and moral responsible if it's not true. So that's kind of the the force of the conclusion of the article. Let's talk a little bit about the significance of the article. I've already mentioned that it spawned a whole new branch of literature on the issue of moral responsibility, freedom, and determinism. Hundreds of articles and papers were written. Just to mention a few people: Ishtiaki Haji, John Martin Fisher, Mark Revizza, Susan Wolf, Eleanor Stopp, David Hott, many, many others. And there's now then a new concern. If Frankfurt's correct and moral responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, then what exactly does it require? We have this negative third version of the principle of moral responsibility, but alternative possibilities, sorry, principle of alternative possibilities, but that's just negative. What does moral responsibility require if that initial principle is true? And here are two broad directions that people have taken in response to these Frankfurt cases. One is to defend or revise the principle of alternative possibilities. Peter Van Inwagen has done this, Carl Genet has done it, Robert Kane, Timothy O'Connor, I've done it, David Whitaker has done it. So that's one path. Of course, a path that I'm not mentioning is to kind of defend Frankfurt and say that Frankfurt's correct here. But some of the people who have done that develop a different theory of moral responsibility that shows how one could be morally responsible without the ability to do otherwise. So people who are convinced by Frankfurt-style examples, and I'm making them plural now because of all the literature that there is out there, and that includes John Martin Fisher, Mark Revizza, Susan Wolf, and Eleanor Stopp. What they've done then is they've developed their theories of moral responsibility from the point of view that the principle of alternative possibility fails, and so do the revisions. They also fail. And so we have to talk about moral responsibility in a different way than the traditional libertarian view that says we need these genuine alternatives, these forking paths before us, these options that are available in order to be free and morally responsible. So this is the foundation for all this literature on moral responsibility. And we'll look at a few different directions that people have taken here in future videos.